There is a subtle, often overlooked truth in the simple preference to avoid the presence of others. To some, the arrival of visitors is merely a social inconvenience, a disruption of the day's rhythm. Yet, if we look beneath the surface, this reaction speaks volumes about the inner workings of the psyche and the sacred space of the self. When one recoils from the intrusion of company, it is rarely a matter of mere rudeness or superficial disdain. Rather, it reveals a profound relationship with one's inner world, an instinctive need to safeguard the sanctuary of solitude where thought, feeling, and imagination may unfold freely. The psyche is a complex and delicate ecosystem, and the intrusion of another consciousness, even a familiar one, can stir currents we are not prepared to navigate. This tendency to withdraw from visitors can indicate a heightened sensitivity to the energies of others. Each person brings a constellation of emotions, expectations, and intention, and those who prefer solitude may sense these vibrations more acutely. The soul, in its deep, uncharted recesses, seeks clarity and authenticity. It requires spaces uncolored by the judgments, assumptions, and projections of others. It is in these spaces that the self can engage in honest dialogue with the unconscious, allowing dreams, insights, and hidden patterns to emerge. Yet, the avoidance of social interaction also reflects an internal dialogue with one's own shadow. Those who instinctively recoil from visitors may be confronting aspects of themselves that are unintegrated or unresolved. The presence of another can act as a mirror, revealing traits, fears, or desires that lie dormant, and the soul may instinctively resist this reflection until it feels prepared. In this resistance, there is not weakness but profound self-preservation, a recognition that the interior world must first be respected before it can be shared. Moreover, this preference may point to a deeper rhythm of introversion, a natural attunement to the inner, rather than the outer world. Here lies a soul that gathers energy from reflection, observation, and contemplation, rather than from the ceaseless stimulation of the external environment. To interrupt this rhythm is to disturb the processes through which creativity, insight, and personal growth unfold. It is vital to understand that such inclinations are not morally charged. Avoiding visitors does not signify selfishness or antisocial tendencies. Rather, it is an invitation to explore the contours of one's psyche with honesty. It is a recognition that authentic connection with the world begins with an intimate and fearless relationship with oneself. To understand the need for solitude is to acknowledge the sacredness of one's inner life and the responsibility to nurture it. In truth, the reluctance to welcome visitors can be a profound signal of a soul in dialogue with itself, a soul aware of its own depths, its vulnerabilities, and its need for careful cultivation. It is a reminder that the path to wholeness requires periods of quietude, reflection, and retreat, and that the external world, however compelling, must never overshadow the internal journey toward understanding, integration, and the awakening of the self. There exists within every individual a sacred inner space, a domain of thought and feeling that is uniquely one's own. This space is often revealed in subtle behaviors, in the preferences that seem trivial yet hold profound significance. The act of avoiding visitors, of retreating from the presence of others, is one such behavior that carries with it deep meaning. It is not merely a matter of comfort or inconvenience, but rather an instinctive safeguarding of the inner sanctuary where the psyche may breathe freely, where the currents of the unconscious may move without interruption, and where the threads of creativity and reflection may weave themselves into understanding and insight. In choosing solitude over company, the soul is asserting its need for a protected environment, an arena in which it can engage with its own depths without the interference of external stimuli that inevitably accompany the presence of another person. Within this inner sanctuary, the individual encounters the vast and often uncharted territories of the mind. Thoughts, emotions, and images arise spontaneously, unbound by the expectations or judgments of society. Each moment of solitude becomes a dialogue between the conscious self and the unconscious forces that shape one's perceptions and decisions. The act of avoiding visitors is therefore not a withdrawal from life, but a deliberate choice to honor the process of internal exploration, recognizing that the presence of others, even those well-intentioned, can disrupt the fragile balance required for introspection. In this sense, the preference for solitude is a form of self-preservation, an acknowledgement that the integrity of one's inner life demands careful attention and protection. Moreover, This retreat from social engagement often reflects a heightened sensitivity to the energies of others. Every person carries with them a constellation of emotions, desires, fears, and projections, and for those attuned to the subtleties of human presence, these energies can be both overwhelming and intrusive. The soul, in its quiet wisdom, discerns when it is appropriate to open itself to external influence and when it is necessary to maintain boundaries. By choosing to limit social interaction, the individual exercises a form of discernment, safeguarding the purity of their inner experience, that the unconscious mind can operate without contamination from the moods and expectations of others. This discernment is not a sign of weakness or avoidance, but rather an acknowledgement of the delicate interplay between inner and outer realities, and a recognition that meaningful engagement with the world requires an intact and vibrant inner life. The act of avoiding visitors also provides a mirror to the process of shadow work. When one is confronted with the presence of another, certain aspects of the self, though hidden, unacknowledged, or unintegrated, may be reflected back in subtle ways. The laughter, gestures, and even silences of another person can awaken thoughts and emotions that have been carefully repressed or ignored. To retreat from such reflection is not to deny it, but to allow it to be approached on one's own terms, to give the soul the time and space necessary to confront and integrate these aspects without pressure or distraction. Solitude becomes a laboratory of self-discovery, a place where one can examine the unconscious contents of the mind with honesty and courage, and where the individual can slowly, deliberately, and safely bring these elements into conscious awareness. It is also important to recognize that the preference for solitude often aligns with the natural rhythms of introversion. Those who find themselves uncomfortable or drained by the presence of visitors may be attuned to an inner world that thrives on reflection, observation, and deep thought rather than external stimulation. The psyche, in its wisdom, seeks replenishment in quietude, drawing energy from contemplation rather than from social interaction. To respect this need is to honor the architecture of the soul, understanding that the richness of one's inner life is cultivated not through constant engagement with others, but through periods of retreat that allow insight, creativity, and emotional equilibrium to flourish. The presence of visitors, though potentially enriching in other contexts, may interrupt this essential rhythm, creating a dissonance that diminishes the capacity for self-knowledge and authentic expression. Furthermore, the act of avoiding visitors can be seen as a subtle form of self-assertion. By creating boundaries around one's personal space, the individual communicates, often unconsciously, that their inner life is valuable, fragile, and deserving of protection. This is not a statement of hostility or rejection, but a recognition that true presence with oneself requires intentionality and care. The soul demands moments in which it is unobserved, unjudged, and free to wander the vast landscapes of imagination, memory, and insight. In these moments, the psyche can engage in the delicate work of synthesis, connecting disparate elements of experience into coherent understanding, and nurturing the growth of wisdom that can later be shared with the world. The avoidance of visitors is thus not withdrawal from life, but a necessary precondition for authentic engagement with it. In addition, solitude cultivates the capacity for deep listening and observation. In the absence of external conversation, the mind becomes attuned to the subtler rhythms of thought and feeling. One begins to perceive the nuances of inner dialogue, the hidden patterns in dreams, and the recurring motifs that shape behavior and emotion. The absence of visitors allows for the uninterrupted unfolding of these processes, creating a space in which the individual can engage fully with the questions and mysteries that arise from within. The soul, unburdened by the expectations of others, can explore its own landscapes with freedom, discovering insights that might otherwise remain obscured by the distractions and demands of social presence. It is crucial to understand that this preference for solitude carries no moral judgment, no implication of social deficiency, and no condemnation of the external world. Rather, it is an expression of the soul's need for sanctuary, for the quiet cultivation of understanding, and for the preservation of the delicate processes that sustain creativity, emotional clarity, and psychological integration. To recognize the value of solitude is to acknowledge the profound responsibility one holds toward oneself, to honor the inner life, to nurture its growth, and to protect it from unnecessary disturbance. In this light, avoiding visitors is not an act of avoidance, but an affirmation of the sacredness of the soul, a recognition that the most meaningful engagement with the world arises from the integrity and vitality of the self-cultivated in quiet. Reflection, the inclination to avoid visitors, often reflects a sensitivity to the subtle energies that others bring in one's presence, an attunement to emotional, psychological, and even unconscious currents that flow between individuals. Each person carries a constellation of feelings, expectations, and projections, often unspoken yet profoundly influential. For those who are acutely aware of these undercurrents, the presence of visitors can feel like an intrusion, a disruption to the equilibrium of the inner world. The soul, in its quiet wisdom, senses that interaction is not merely an exchange of words or gestures, but a complex interplay of conscious and unconscious forces that can disturb the delicate balance of thought and feeling cultivated in solitude. In this way, the avoidance of social engagement is not a matter of dislike or social awkwardness, but rather an instinctive response to the subtle influence that others exert, an act of self-preservation that protects the integrity of one's inner life. Sensitivity to others is not merely a trait, but a function of the psyche's deep capacity for perception. Those who recoil from visitors often experience the world through multiple layers simultaneously, perceiving not only what is said, but also what is implied, what is unspoken, and the emotions that resonate beneath the surface. This heightened awareness can create a sense of overwhelm when confronted with the presence of others, whose moods, intentions, and energies intertwine with one's own in ways that are not always consciously recognized. To retreat, then, is to create a buffer, a protective space in which the soul can breathe and in which the inner life can unfold without interference. It is an acknowledgement that interaction with the external world requires discernment, and that the capacity to engage meaningfully is contingent upon maintaining the clarity and equilibrium of one's internal environment. The avoidance of visitors also illuminates the soul's relationship with boundaries. Boundaries are not merely social constructs, but psychological necessities that define the space in which the self can develop and thrive. By limiting exposure to others, the individual asserts these boundaries, protecting the inner sanctum from intrusion and ensuring that the energies of others do not overwhelm or distort the natural rhythms of thought and reflection. In doing so, the soul demonstrates a profound understanding of the interplay between internal and external life, recognizing that meaningful engagement with the world is only possible when the self is intact, centered, and unperturbed by uninvited disturbances. This act of discernment is a form of self-respect and a recognition of the sacredness of one's inner experience. In addition, sensitivity to others often highlights the unconscious dialogues that unfold within social interaction. Visitors, consciously or unconsciously, may trigger projections, reactions, or patterns that the soul is not ready to confront. The presence of another person can illuminate hidden fears, unresolved conflict, or latent desires, serving as a mirror to the unexamined parts of the psyche. To avoid such interaction is not avoidance in the negative sense, but a deliberate choice to allow these reflections to emerge in their own time and in a controlled environment where they can be observed, understood, and integrated without the added complexity of external interference. The soul, in this respect, exercises a careful and conscious stewardship of its own development, understanding that growth requires moments of unobserved introspection and the ability to confront unconscious material on one's own terms. Furthermore, this sensitivity is closely linked to the rhythms of introversion, which govern the flow of energy within the psyche. Individuals who prefer solitude often draw strength from introspection, observation, and quiet contemplation, replenishing their reserves through inward focus rather than external stimulation. The arrival of visitors interrupts these rhythms, demanding engagement that is taxing to the energy and attention of the soul. By retreating, the individual preserves the capacity for reflection and creativity, allowing the unconscious mind the space to operate, to process, and to communicate its subtle insights without interference. This preservation of energy is not a withdrawal from life, but a strategic alignment with the natural processes of the psyche, ensuring that the individual remains whole, centered, and capable of authentic interaction when the time is right. The avoidance of visitors also reflects an awareness of emotional boundaries and the need to protect psychological equilibrium. Every interaction carries potential emotional cost, and those attuned to the current of feeling may sense the subtle shifts that accompany social presence. The soul recognizes that these shifts, while often unnoticed by the casual observer, can create tension, distraction, or confusion if the psyche is not adequately prepared to absorb them. In this way, sensitivity to others functions as a kind of internal compass, guiding the individual toward interaction that are harmonious and constructive while steering away from those that might disrupt inner stability. It is a recognition that true engagement requires readiness, and that the health of the inner world is a prerequisite for meaningful connection with the outer. Moreover, this heightened sensitivity fosters the capacity for empathy and discernment, qualities that are cultivated in solitude and reflection. By retreating from the demands and influences of visitors, the individual is able to refine the understanding of subtle emotional dynamics, to perceive the intentions and feelings of others without being unduly influenced or overwhelmed by them. Solitude thus becomes both a refuge and a training ground where the soul can observe the interplay of unconscious force, recognize patterns in behavior and thought, and cultivate the wisdom necessary to navigate complex human relationships. The avoidance of visitors is therefore a form of preparation, a method by which the psyche strengthens its ability to engage authentically and compassionately when the time for interaction arises. Ultimately, sensitivity to others as revealed through the avoidance of visitors is a reflection of the soul's ongoing dialogue with itself. It signifies an awareness that interaction is not a simple exchange of words or action, but a meeting of energies that requires careful attention and discernment. The soul, in its quiet vigilance, recognizes the need for boundaries, for space, and for time in which the inner life may flourish undisturbed. In this understanding, avoidance is not a failure or a flaw, but an expression of the profound respect for the subtle and delicate processes of the psyche, an acknowledgement that true engagement with the world arises from the clarity, strength, and integrity of the self cultivate. In the quiet and unobserved moments of reflection and awareness, the tendency to withdraw from visitors often reveals a subtle, profound engagement with the unconscious aspects of the self, a willingness to confront inner realities that are not always visible to the conscious mind. When another person enters the space, they bring with them a mirror of sorts, reflecting back aspects of our own psyche that may be unacknowledged, hidden, or unresolved. These reflections can be gentle, illuminating unnoticed traits or dormant potentials, or they can be disruptive, stirring fears, insecurities, or unresolved conflicts that the conscious mind is not ready to face. The act of avoiding visitors, then, is not a mere preference for comfort or quiet, but a deliberate decision by the soul to regulate the timing and manner of its encounter with these reflections, allowing the psyche to engage with its own shadow in a controlled, manageable environment. Every individual carries within them a shadow, the collection of traits, impulses, and emotions that have been repressed, ignored, or denied because they conflict with societal expectations or self-image. The presence of visitors can act as a catalyst, revealing these aspects in ways that are often unconscious. A word, a tone of voice, a glance, or even silence can stir recognition of a hidden fear, desire, or vulnerability. For those attuned to the subtleties of their inner life, this can feel overwhelming, a sudden confrontation with the parts of the self that require integration. To retreat from social interaction is therefore an act of self-preservation, a recognition that the inner work of shadow engagement is delicate and requires space, time, and introspection. It is a choice to face the inner world on one's own terms rather than under the subtle pressure of external presence. This inclination also highlights the importance of solitude as a container for psychic growth. In the absence of visitors, the mind can explore its own landscapes without distraction or interference, allowing unconscious material to surface naturally and organically. Dreams, memories, recurring thoughts, and emotions emerge with clarity, forming patterns and connections that may otherwise be obscured by social demands. The act of withdrawing from others is thus not avoidance in the sense of denial, but a cultivation of conditions in which the soul can engage deeply and authentically with its own content. It is in these quiet moments that the individual can observe, reflect, and integrate, slowly reconciling the shadow with the conscious self and fostering the development of wholeness. The avoidance of visitors also speaks to the dynamics of projection and recognition. Often, when in the company of others, the psyche projects unacknowledged aspects of the self on them, seeing in their words or actions traits that are, in fact, reflections of internal content. These projections can be subtle, creating irritation, attraction, judgment, or admiration that is rooted more in one's own inner state than in objective reality. By maintaining solitude, the individual reduces the likelihood of such projection, creating a clear space in which internal conflicts can be recognized as belonging to the self rather than misattributed to another. This clarity is essential for the process of individuation, the gradual integration of unconscious material into conscious awareness, allowing the self to mature and develop without distortion from misperceived external influences. Furthermore, the retreat from social engagement provides an opportunity to cultivate inner dialogue. Within the quiet, the psyche speaks in its own language, offering insight through intuition, imagery, and spontaneous association. These messages are often muted or suppressed in the presence of others, whose energies and expectations can dominate attention and perception. The act of withdrawing is therefore a conscious facilitation of inner communication, a recognition that the soul requires uninterrupted channels through which its deepest truths can emerge. The ability to listen to oneself without distraction fosters wisdom, self-understanding, and an authentic connection with the unconscious that forms the foundation for meaningful life choices and personal growth. Sensitivity to the impact of visitors also reveals a recognition of the interplay between inner and outer worlds. Each interaction carries with it potential emotional, psychological, and energetic consequences, and those who instinctively withdraw are attuned to these subtleties. They understand that meaningful connection is not simply a matter of presence but requires readiness, receptivity, and clarity of mind. By choosing solitude, the individual ensures that when engagement does occur, it is authentic and constructive rather than reactive or superficial. The avoidance of visitors is therefore an act of strategic self-care, protecting the psyche from unnecessary turbulence, while fostering the conditions necessary for deep and meaningful interaction when it is appropriate. The process of withdrawing from visitors is also intimately connected with the cultivation of personal boundaries. These boundaries are not rigid walls, but flexible markers that define the space in which the self can flourish. By controlling the influx of external influences, the soul safeguards its autonomy, preserves energy, and creates the conditions for the integration of internal experiences. Boundaries thus function as a protective measure, allowing the psyche to navigate the complexities of social life without being overwhelmed or fragmented. In this sense, avoidance is not rejection but an exercise of conscious agency, a declaration that the integrity of the inner world takes precedence over convenience or social expectation. Moreover, the preference for solitude highlights a natural rhythm of introversion, in which energy and insight are drawn from internal exploration rather than external stimulation. Those who feel discomfort in the presence of visitors are often in tune with this rhythm, recognizing that the inner life thrives in moments of quiet reflection, observation, and contemplation. Social interaction, though valuable, demands attention and energy that may otherwise be directed toward the unconscious processes that underpin creativity, problem-solving, and personal development. Solitude, then, is not isolation but an intentional cultivation of conditions in which the soul can evolve, where the unconscious can reveal its wisdom and where the shadow may be engaged, reconciled, and integrated. Ultimately, the avoidance of visitors signals a sophisticated and delicate engagement with the self, an acknowledgement that the journey toward wholeness requires moments of retreat, introspection, and careful negotiation of the inner and outer worlds. It reflects a deep understanding that authentic engagement with life arises from a psyche that is intact, self-aware, and attuned to its own rhythms. In choosing to limit external intrusion, the individual honors the processes of shadow work, reflection, and self-integration, recognizing that the preservation of inner space is a prerequisite for the meaningful expression of the self in the world. The preference for solitude and the reluctance to welcome visitors often reflects an inner attunement to the natural rhythms of the psyche, a recognition that the inner life is delicate, complex, and requires careful nurturing. Those who instinctively seek solitude over social engagement are often guided by a deep sense of internal timing, awareness that energy, creativity, and insight flourish when the soul is given space to operate without interference. The presence of visitors, while potentially enriching, introduces external stimuli that can disrupt this internal equilibrium, drawing attention away from the subtle processes of reflection, introspection, and unconscious exploration that sustain the development of the self. In this way, the act of retreat is not mere avoidance, but an acknowledgement that the inner life has its own priorities, rhythms which must be respected for the psyche to function optimally and for the soul to remain whole and centered. Solitude offers a unique environment in which the psyche can engage in processes of self-organization and integration. Within quiet, uninterrupted space, the mind can explore the rich landscapes of memory, imagination, and emotion, connecting disparate threads of experience into coherent understanding. The unconscious, often quiet and subtle in its communication, requires this space to emerge and speak, presenting symbols, insights, and intuitive knowledge that guide the conscious self toward growth and wholeness. Visitors, by their presence, even if unintentional, impose external rhythms and demands that can overshadow these processes, interrupting the natural flow of psychic activity. The individual attuned to these inner currents recognizes the necessity of preserving moments of retreat, understanding that meaningful engagement with life and others depends upon the vitality and integrity of the internal world. The avoidance of visitors also underscores a heightened awareness of the dynamics of energy exchange. Every interaction carries potential influences, conscious and unconscious, that affect mood, focus, and emotional balance. Those who are sensitive to these shifts often prefer to control the influx of external energy, ensuring that the inner atmosphere remains conducive to reflection and creativity. The presence of another person, even a close acquaintance, can introduce subtle tensions, unspoken expectations, or projections that ripple through the psyche, demanding adaptation, interpretation, or defense. Solitude becomes a protective measure, a way of conserving emotional and cognitive resources so that they may be invested intentionally in tasks, thoughts, or creative processes that sustain and enhance the self. This inclination toward retreat is also closely connected with the cultivation of personal boundaries, which function as both shield and guide. By limiting exposure to visitors, the individual establishes a space in which the inner life can unfold without interruption, allowing the processes of insight, reflection, and self-discovery to develop at their natural pace. Boundaries are not arbitrary barriers, but rather expressions of psychological wisdom, marking the limit of energy, attention, and engagement that can be offered to the outside world without depleting the self. In respecting these boundaries, the soul preserves its integrity and cultivates the conditions necessary for authentic relationships and meaningful interaction when engagement does occur, ensuring that connection is a reflection of fullness rather than need or depletion. The preference for solitude also enhances the capacity for introspection and self-understanding. In the absence of visitors, the mind is free to observe its own processes, to trace the contours of thought and emotion without distraction, and to engage in the delicate work of reconciling conscious intentions with unconscious impulses. Patterns that might remain obscured in the presence of others emerge clearly, allowing the individual to recognize recurring themes, unconscious biases, and unresolved conflicts. Solitude becomes a laboratory for the soul, a place where experimentation, observation, and reflection can occur safely and fully. Through this process, the individual gains the self-knowledge necessary to navigate the external world with awareness, intentionality, and authenticity, approaching interactions with others from a place of groundedness rather than reaction. Moreover, the act of retreat reflects an understanding of the interplay between inner and outer life. The psyche operates according to its own rhythms, and meaningful engagement with others is most effective when the self is in harmony with its internal processes. Visitors, though often welcomed socially, can impose a rhythm external to that of the individual, requiring attention, energy, and emotional adaptation that may not align with the natural cadence of the psyche. Recognizing this, the soul exercises discernment, choosing the timing, frequency, and context of social engagement in a way that maximizes presence, clarity, and authenticity. This deliberate management of interaction is not antisocial behavior but an expression of psychological wisdom, acknowledging the interdependence of inner harmony and outer engagement. The avoidance of visitors can also reveal a preference for depth over breadth in relational experience. Those who favor solitude often prioritize meaningful connections that are chosen and intentional rather than obligatory or superficial. By limiting social exposure, the individual ensures that interactions are approached with full attention and openness, rather than as a perfunctory fulfillment of social expectation. Solitude, in this sense, serves as a preparation, allowing the psyche to cultivate clarity, presence, and emotional readiness so that when interaction occurs, it is rich, authentic, and reciprocal. The refusal of casual or uninvited engagement thus becomes a form of self-respect, preserving the soul, a capacity to connect in a manner that reflects its true depth rather than its reactive tendencies. Additionally, retreat fosters the cultivation of creativity, insight, and personal growth. The uninterrupted space provided by solitude allows the unconscious to surface in ways that inform artistic expression, problem-solving, and personal understanding. Symbols, ideas, and intuitive knowledge emerge spontaneously, often in forms that require silence and reflection to be fully apprehended. Visitors, by introducing external demands and attention, can disrupt this delicate process, diverting energy away from the unconscious work that underpins innovation and personal development. The act of withdrawal, therefore, is not merely protective but generative, creating conditions in which the inner life can produce its richest fruits, which may later be shared with the world in a manner that is considered authentic and transformative. Finally, the preference for solitude signals a sophisticated awareness of the soul's needs, a recognition that the self is nurtured through reflection, integration, and the careful management of energy and attention. By choosing to limit the presence of others, the individual honors the realm's sensitivity and processes that sustain personal growth and psychological health. In doing so, the psyche is able to operate at its fullest capacity, engaging with the unconscious, integrating the shadow, and cultivating the insights and wisdom necessary for meaningful engagement with life. Solitude becomes a source of strength, a condition for clarity, and a crucible in which the soul refines its understanding of itself and its place in the world.